Hello, and welcome to this video mini from Disasterwise, a series of 10-minute microclasses on the myths, maths, and management of crisis and disaster. Today, I'll be talking about the calculus of calamity, the central premise of which is that there is a cold, hard calculus to calamity. Disasters, after all, are not inevitable. Who dies and who survives is determined by a complex interplay of roughly 50 key risk factors, all of which, at least to some extent, can be controlled. Hello, my name is James Shepherd-Barron. I'm a disaster risk management consultant and founder of Disasterwise.org. The calculus of calamity is an integrated optimization model for managing the reduction of disaster risk. And it organizes 50 of the main determinants of disaster across 7 core domains, as depicted by the hieroglyphics in this algorithm here. And we'll look at each of these in a bit more detail in just a minute. Being about the avoidance of unnecessary death and destruction through optimizing the allocation of scarce resources, it's a useful tool when planning for or responding to disasters. The calculus of calamity differs from the more simplistic and traditional models of disaster management and humanitarian coordination in a number of important ways. The first of these is that it integrates disaster epidemiology, health economics, business administration, behavioral psychology, and risk management into the wider disaster risk reduction calculus. But there are a number of other ways in which it is differentiated too. It acknowledges the international dimension to disaster risk, and that includes the compounding and cascading risks and the increasing requirement nowadays for cross-border collaboration as risk appears to be growing faster than we're able to reduce it. Explicitly acknowledges the need for the appliance of science, i.e. the application of evidence-based decision-making. It recognizes risk perception, behavior, and management, all as risk factors in their own right. It measures outcomes in terms of public health protection. It includes social utility in value for money calculations. It optimizes operational performance by using measurable key performance indicators. It nudges actuation of real-time behavior change. And it encompasses all types of disaster across all phases, from resilience and readiness to response, recovery, and reconstruction. And it does this at all scales. So I said I would unpack the algorithm with a bit more detail. First is when we talk about disaster, we're talking about disaster loss. This is human, social, and capital loss, not just in absolute terms, in terms of mortality, for example, or capital values, but the rate at which this loss occurs too. And I want to reiterate what I said right at the beginning. Hazards are inevitable, but disasters are optional. Disasters are what happens when natural phenomena or man-made hazards collide with human behavior to disrupt and temporarily overwhelm local coping capacities. They are not divine tragedies ordained by capricious gods. They are social constructs, the product of interactions between different types of hazard and historical, social, and political forces. They are processes, not events, the result of decades of accumulated risk interacting with vulnerable communities ill-prepared to cope with or adapt to the emerging realities of shifting political ideologies. In this sense, disasters are caused by vulnerability, not hazards. There are over 300 different types of hazard grouped into 9 categories: geophysical, meteorological, hydrological, climatological, biological, non-terrestrial, technological, societal, and environmental. A hazard is determined by its type. Some are more dangerous than others, and by their incidence, or otherwise known as frequency or sometimes return interval, and are a function of their magnitude, their scope, their scale, and their intensity. They're two different things. Intensity being the energy unleashed. Also the location, of course, and a lesser known one, whether they are predictable or not, and therefore whether early warning is possible. And here I've separated out the small r, which means residual risk, because as I said earlier, it's a risk factor in its own right. Risk is a subjective measure. It refers here to the way it is perceived, and therefore as a society or as a family or as an individual, to work out what is acceptable. What is your risk tolerance? What is the threshold at which you will take an action and below which you won't? It's also a function of the effectiveness of risk communications. And all of this is driven by biases and disaster dissonance of human behavior, when people say they will do one thing, but actually in the heat of the moment end up doing another. And a good indicator of all of this, as the COVID pandemic pointed out, would be, for example, vaccine hesitancy, when risk has been assessed and yet nevertheless people decide to take an irrational, or what to many seems to be an irrational response. It stands for social vulnerability, things like nutritional status or food security phase classification. Also, and don't mix this up with the risk we just talked about, for example, vaccination coverage will have something to say about how vulnerable you are to an impending calamity. E refers to the population exposed or potentially exposed, both in terms of absolute numbers and population density, i.e. are they in remote rural areas or high-rise urban areas. It also will be affected by the time of day the hazard strikes and even the season, as that will affect tourist levels and the number of people around, or temperatures, that kind of thing. And also, crucially, whether early warning systems exist and whether they are effective. And that in turn will lead to evacuation, whether evacuation has been practiced, whether routes are clearly marked, and whether people have access to public transport. Resilience is about coping capacity, but it's also about the extent to which communities are able to adapt to longer term pressures and risks, such as, for example, climate change. Usually measured with indicators such as whether individuals have first aid training, what hospital capacity there is, but also increasingly looking at Gini coefficients like income disparities, disability dependency ratios, whether or not there is insurance coverage, and if so, at what level, how many people own smartphones, and more nowadays, financial inclusion and whether affected populations have access to cash. Now, the M stands for management effectiveness and efficiency. Here, I'm just particularly focusing on effectiveness and governance, factors for which would include female inclusion, professionalization, localization, and political performance. Corruption, for example. It also looks at operational capacity in terms of assets, stockpiles, and then resource mobilization, available funds. And the small I refers to a subset of disaster risk management called information management. This is all about the application of evidence to decision making, which is scientific and transparent, and therefore an aid to accountability. This is a risk profile in its own right, because it's a career in its own right, but it is a subset of disaster risk management. And finally, I've differentiated management efficiency as part of the management mix in terms of value for money. There are two things to look at here. One is that we're looking at utility cost, i.e. the social usefulness perceived by those potentially in harm's way, and that is measured, or should be measured, in terms of a cost per disability adjusted life year averted per intervention. Well, thanks for your time, a little over 10 minutes. I hope you found this short Disasterwise presentation useful. If you want to know more about it or any other disaster-related topic, please take a look at the disasterwise.org website, and that is where you can also subscribe. Stay safe wherever you are, and until next time, goodbye.